Thank you everyone for attending our virtual session on rolling out Azure Windows Virtual Desktop for remote employees, presented by San Jose Evergreen Community College District and Forelli. Next slide. I'd like to introduce you to our presenters, Sergio Oklander, Director of Enterprise Applications at San Jose Evergreen Community College District, Christine Bailey, Senior Consultant at Forelli, and myself, Robert Forelli, President. So when COVID-19 hit, we found the challenges to get employees remote. VPN solutions were not fully deployed. A lot of concern around unmanaged devices being used to access work resources, people using insecure Wi-Fi, and malicious browser plugins. Sergio, what are some of the challenges that you found in your district?
Yes, when everybody had to go and suddenly work from home, we have a situation in which our VPN was only meant to be for a few particular users. So it wasn't easily scaled. There was licensing issues, performance issues, and the concern of connecting on the VPN using unmanaged devices. So we had to come up with a way to deliver desktops or the ability to access internal applications to our users, to all that stuff. And the option of creating a virtual desktop infrastructure inside with the hardware resources we had was not gonna be something that we could do in a timely fashion. So given the landscape, we turned to Forelli to discover that Microsoft has a Windows desktop service and implementing it in order to not to have to use VPN, the access is direct, fully integrated, not having to build a whole knowledge base on the users and not overly stress the current resources.
Next slide. So Azure Windows Virtual Desktop was the perfect solution. One, there's no upfront capital costs, no termination fees, and you pay for only what you use. And like Sergio said, the district already used Microsoft for Office 365. And ultimately, the district needed to provide the staff with on-campus applications and file shares. And we're able to handle all those secure connections on the back end. And for the end user, it looks like their normal desktop at work. Next slide. What we're covering today is Azure Windows Virtual Desktop prereqs, installation overview, Azure costing and licensing requirements, and cloud security best practices. And now I will hand it off to Christine Bailey, Senior Consultant here at Forelli.
So plan it out. The first thing that we ask for the clients is to really think about how we're going to deploy the virtual environment into their existing services, what is lacking currently, and what we're looking to provide by deploying this environment. Create your Azure resources first. Pay attention to the regions to assure the needed services available in that area. If you're familiar with Microsoft and regions, you'll know that certain services are not available in certain regions. Consider factors like a site-to-site tunnel access for internal resources, and if Azure AD Connect is required for your setup. Pay attention to what you guys currently are doing with your IAM, right? Identity Access Management. Where does your identity live right now? Are you guys doing it on-premise AD? Is it already hybrid and extended? You know, pay attention to that and really lean on that for this environment and make sure that that is set up before you walk into this entire deployment. And create a worksheet and create a naming convention that works for organization. Azure is not friendly to renaming things. So we want to make sure that what we're going to have in there from a management standpoint as well is that we know what we're supporting, and that way users as well that are managing these systems have what they need to secure these resources. A few things to consider with your Azure networking. Look at your virtual network to make sure that it supports the resources that you're going to be deploying for now and in the future. You cannot change your virtual network subnet once it's already deployed. So typically we like to start with a /16 and kind of break it out into how we're going to be setting these up and what the use of those applications and resources are. For the subnets, create subnets to separate traffic types. Look to use service endpoints if there is certain traffic that you want to be separated. And make sure that you set network security groups on them to secure. And we're making sure that the people that have access do have access and those that don't. And if you want to utilize the Azure Bastion host, make sure you have a subnet named Azure Bastion Network with at least a /27 subnet to accommodate that network. Next slide. Azure WVD overview. So what we're going to look at just from a high level is how does WVD work, right? So we're looking at the control plane and we have 3 host pool types here. We have a remote app, a pooled, and a personal. Personal is going to be a machine that is handed off to a user and they're going to interact with it like it is their desktop at work. You can apply group policy to this and you can also secure this with your on-premise tools. You will just have to make sure that you do have the requirements set up before you do that. For a pooled host, we're going to be looking at sharing a server among a group of individuals. And for remote apps, we're only going to be pushing out applications to a group of users. And then from the subscription level, you can see that we have the session hosts and we have our Active Directory domain services and file services. Next slide. And so the sample worksheet that we had spoke about in the earlier slide, this is kind of a high level of what we're looking for here, right? So we have a virtual network and we've named it Institutional AZ and we're looking at that 10.0.0. Again, this is the default network. A couple things that catch people up is look at what your on-premise internal networking scheme is and make sure there's not going to be a conflict with your Azure networking scheme. Subnets, we have one set up for workstations. For resources groups, we again keep with the same naming convention. We put the name of the institution. We put net for the network resources because we wanted all those to be secured. Again, we're looking at grouping resources based on how they're going to be secured and also their life cycle itself. So we also have one set up for WVD. We also have the network security group, and that is set up for workstations because we're going to apply security group level for that. There is also application security groups you can look at as well. And then log analytics workspace, we set that up. We put the LA just to note that that is the log analytics automation account, which is the AA that we set up. And again, these are tools that you're going to need to support that WVD environment once it goes live. We'll talk about this later in the slide, but you will have some responsibilities to this environment and making sure that environment stays up to date. And then the tenant name again, and the host pool we have named Institutional AZ with that. Can you go ahead and go to the next slide? And what do you need to get started? So Azure subscription, we know this, Azure Active Directory domain services and Azure Active Directory tenant. Those are the identity access management pieces that I spoke about. Make sure that you have those pieces set up. If you're not leaning on their domain services, make sure that you have the necessary hybrid AD Connect set up as well. So for licensing, we are looking at a Windows 10 Enterprise user subscription for every WVD user, and then a file server or NetApp files to store user profiles. What we're looking at there is how, again, you're going to use this environment. If you want a user to share a host, maybe we have 3 hosts set up and 20 users and we want their profiles to go with them. So we want to make sure that we can accommodate that profile storage somewhere. You, again, look up NetApp or, lean on a file server as well, but that will be determined on performance. Next slide. And these are going to be the basic steps that we're kind of just talk high level of what will happen when you try to go and create a virtual desktop environment. So the first thing that we're doing is we're creating a host pool. At this point, we're going to assume that you have created your image that you want to use for the session hosts and that now you're ready to start the process of creating your first host pool. Again, start small, doing one host pool and one session host, getting it up and running, checking performance, seeing how it interacts with your internal resources is really a good starting place for you. And then next slide. And again, reiterating what a host pool is, it is a collection of Azure virtual desktops registered to the WVD as session host when you run the virtual desktop agent. So when we start this process, as you can kind of see from the screenshot, the basics is what they're asking you to fill out here is your subscription, your host pool, and again, paying attention to that location. Remember when we talked about the regions, planning this out and making sure that those regions support the services that you are trying to deploy for your institution. And then we also have the validation environment if one exists, and then the host pool. That goes back to those three choices again between the pooled and the personal and the remote application. Session limit and the load balancing algorithm you will have to discuss later, but if you look that up, that will be determined upon how users are connecting to the environment and how resources are handed back to them. Go ahead, next slide. And the workspace. So again, we talked about this wizard, how we're walking through this. We provided the basics. We've already specified what our virtual machines are. We've built our virtual machines at this point. And now the workspace is where do your users connect to, right? So when your users are accessing this environment, whether it is through the remote application or it is through the URL that Microsoft provides, you can actually specify it here. And go ahead, next slide. Now, app groups. App groups is a logical grouping of applications installed on session hosts in the host pools. So again, this goes back to the permissions of what users will have access to. So remote app we would be using if we were doing the remote apps, desktop we would be doing for the full desktop experience. Next slide. To connect to this environment, this is, again, we talked about that workspace that we had originally created, and we also have the URL. If you notice in the URL, you'll see the ARM, which stands for Azure Resource Manager. If that is not there, you are on a non-ARM install, and that is the original deployment method, and there is ways to upgrade that as well. You can look at Microsoft documentation for that. Next slide. We can kind of go into the costs now. So Microsoft offers a pricing calculator that you can use to kind of see what this would look like for your users based on how many they did, and also that, again, when we speak about the workloads, right? Heavy workload users, medium workload users, and what that looks like for your institution. Be sure to include other Azure services and costs associated with those components, right? So are you doing your patch management through there? Are you utilizing their vulnerability management tools that are available there? When you're in Azure, the best thing for cost is only set up services to be running when you need them to be run. So, lean on the solutions that they allow you to have to turn resources on and off. At San Jose, we have it set up so it turns on and off only when their active hours are, and turned off in nighttime. So that way they have some savings with those hours that they're seeing in the off hours. And then make sure that you have the monitor logs accounted for. The storage that you will be paying for with that, you can kind of make that determination. They have log analytics usage and estimated costs, and you can kind of use that data to make an educated guess on what the cost offset will be. Next slide. What are eligible license to access WVD? This is kind of a high overview of them, E3, E5. Again, if you are at a lower level and you don't have this access yet, plan this out. Maybe it makes sense to build other products into here and lean on the other products that are available to you at that resource level. There are security tools, there's data loss prevention tools that start coming available to you just by upping your subscription with Microsoft. If you're not sure where you stand with Microsoft licensing, you can always come to us. We can help you figure out where that's at. We can help you figure out what that deployment looks like for you, and really help you understand how you're using those services with Microsoft to the full benefits. Next slide. And now this is going to go into, again, we cannot secure the WVD environment fully in 25 minutes, but let's go over a few high-level steps. And towards the end of the slide, we will provide you a few links that you can use to kind of further up this conversation. So one is use conditional access on MFA to secure your tenant further. So a couple ones that I like to do is we use some for time restrictions. We will use some for group restrictions. If you have a certain level, we can do privileged identity management and set it up where you can only use administrative rights to access the backend environment. A lockdown session host using group policy. At San Jose, what we like to do is we have literally secured it where users cannot access PowerShell, users cannot access the command prompt, right? If we limit the surface attack area, it really does help with the buy-in from the institution itself. And then the third one I like to let people know is to collect audit logs, right? Know what's going on in your WVD environment. Build that baseline out so you guys understand what people are doing in that environment and use that data to make decisions to secure it further. Next slide. Azure Bastion. I touched base on this because some people don't have this available. When this is running, it is a cost, so just be aware that there is a cost associated using this, but it is a secure way to access these hosts without using RDP, which is an insecure way, and it only uses SSL. Next slide. Reverse connection. The reason I like to touch base on this is because your traditional RDP is using UDP bidirectional endpoint. And where they've really done a really good job at is that now we're only using HTTPS. And there is no requirement for inbound ports to be configured or open to the VM to have an RDP connection open to the WVD. Next slide. So Windows Virtual Desktop, it is part IaaS and part PaaS, right? So what we're looking at is infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. So those are kind of, you know, what we're responsible for, right? So next slide. So where that comes into play here is where are we responsible at and managing these resources at? Like Sergio spoke about, you know, there is some offset that we can kind of rely on Microsoft to provide some of these resources for us and lean on this existing agreement that we already have. As you can see from this high level that we have from Microsoft, is that from the device level, from the account level, it is always responsible is going to be on the customer. And you can see if you want, the responsibility gets transferred to the cloud provider for physical host, physical network, and physical data center. So again, those are the risks that you are taking off of yourself by moving to a cloud provider. Next slide. WVD architectural overview. So just looking at this again as a high level of what we're responsible for and where this kind of plays into it is that we have the Azure VMs and services, right? Desktops, applications, Active Directory. We have the WVD environment, and then we have the client side. So when we go back to that shared responsibility and we look, you know, from the VM standpoint, we do have to update them, but we can absolutely use Microsoft tools to set that schedule up to get that to run automated and kind of lean on them to set those up. But again, the responsibility comes back to it being on us. Next slide. So kind of wrapping this up, when we spoke about the security earlier, talking about that shared responsibility, I can't stress that enough that you guys have to understand what your role is when you're deploying resources off campus. There's a few links here that you can help with deployment as well as understanding what the cloud security method looks like. And then just to kind of wrap this up, Sergio, now that you guys have had this running, where do you see these benefits for you and the institution?
So it's been a very smooth transition. It provided a lot of benefits in the sense of not having to use VPN, people retaining their desktop just like they do at home, or they used to do at the office. The use of the secure device that we provision and limit the keep logs and limit the access. It's been an all-around benefit, and we didn't have to do a major expense upfront.
Thank you.
Thank you for attending the Forelli Virtual Azure Windows Virtual Desktop session.
Thank you.